Pandemic and Politics, a European Perspective. Welcome to this virtual seminar from the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University in Miami, presented by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series. This seminar is done in collaboration with the European and Eurasian Studies Program and the Václav Havel Program on Human Rights and Diplomacy. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow in the Stephen J. Green School at FIU, and I want to welcome you to this virtual seminar. The coronavirus pandemic has been wreaking havoc around the world, but it has had an especially devastating impact in and on Europe. According to the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, an agency of the European Union, as of April 8th, of more than 1.45 million cases in the world, 634,000 of those have been in Europe, or nearly half of those cases around the globe have come in Europe. Spain has now replaced Italy as the leading country with 140,000 cases, Italy right behind, Germany, France, and then the United Kingdom. Of more than 83,600 deaths so far around the world from the virus, Europe has suffered some 56,839 of those deaths, well more than half of all fatalities. And leading the category in deaths so far, sadly, is Italy, followed by Spain, France, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. In Russia, there are at least 8,700 cases and more than 60 deaths, though the reliability of those statistics has raised some eyebrows. In the UK, of course, Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in intensive care, suffering from the virus. In response to the pandemic, we have seen EU member states act in a very nationally oriented way. We have witnessed China and Russia sending humanitarian assistance, some of it, frankly, not very good or helpful, to countries in Europe scoring political propaganda points. We see the virus spread to Russia where reliable information, as I said, is not very credible. We also see the crisis exacerbate already tense transatlantic relations. Some are questioning what all this means, not only for the future of the European Union, but for democracy more broadly, where some leaders in Europe are using the crisis to solidify their grip on power in a rather authoritarian. So what is the latest state of play? Where might things go from here? To address these and other questions, we have a terrific panel with us today. Marcus Thiel is director of the Jean Monnet EU Center for Excellence as part of the Stephen J. Green School. Rebecca Friedman is director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, also at FIU. And Martin Palusz is director of the Václav Havel Program on Human Rights and Diplomacy, also with the Green School at FIU. So Marcus, if I can, let me start with you, and if you would offer us some opening thoughts.
Yeah, so thank you again for inviting me to this important topic. It's also a very sad topic, and first off, I just want to pause for a second to give thought to the many people that died and that will die. I mean, this is certainly unprecedented, and there's a lot of pain going on right now around the world, which makes all our sort of social isolation and distancing issues rather look like first world problems. But what I want to do in the few minutes, I think you said 5 to 7 minutes that we have, I wanted to quickly, first give a little bit of context of sort of, where the EU policies stand in relation to the member states. And then of course, most importantly, talk about what I think is right now going on, the current issues, and then end with a few points that kind of project out, okay, what are sort of the medium and long-term questions that we have to deal with. So to begin with the context, yeah, and we've talked about this a little bit and discussed this a little bit about the problems of the criticism at Europe and the European Union, right? And I just want to kind of make sure that we all understand that we have here two set of actors. On the one hand, we have the 27 member states. I mean, plus the United Kingdom, which is right now on its Brexit way out, but even that is now, of course, being questioned again with the crisis. So we have the 27 member states. And then we have, on the other set of actors are the EU, the European Union institutions in Brussels, and which are tasked to administer and create common policies on behalf of the member states. So sometimes, or I heard a couple of times and read that, the European Union is not doing enough and everything. But in reality, what would the European Union institutions in Brussels, they are bureaucratic for sure. They take a long time and they may have not started early enough, but it's not their primary fault. In my view, is the 27 member states that could or should be criticized in their action or inaction. And that's just to give you a prime example. There is a separation of tasks within the European Union, and health policy is a national legal competence. That means the European Union has very little power when it comes to doing anything regarding health in Europe. So just like education, taxation, defense, health policy is a national policy in the European Union. So that's why when we way too late recognized that, you know, the crisis that started out in Wuhan, China, is sweeping over into Europe more generally. We recognized this too late. But then you saw, of course, initially the member states take some action or inaction. So both occurred, right? You had, on the one hand, some countries really going very quickly with very restrictive measures such as Italy, of course, where it blew up, Spain, France, Germany, and then you had countries, and still do have countries, that have a more laxer approach, such as particularly the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands and Sweden, which had more appeals, but they kept largely all public institutions open. So there's a diversity of different approaches and different viewpoints. But the European Union, all they could do in the beginning was to kind of make sure that the supply chains within Europe, meaning the transport of goods, that they were not totally cut off, because transport of goods would have led to an immediate economic crisis. People would have had a run on the banks, people would have had a run on the supermarkets, and so on and so on. So that's where the European Union came in. So in the European Union is certainly bureaucratic and is somewhat slow, as we have seen over and over again, but the 27 leaders of the countries and their governments also had their fair share of, should have their fair share of criticism. So that's just to begin with. I do hope, however, that in the end there will be a solution. I hope it's just not, we're going to pay with time and with more deaths the longer there is a common solution. I mean a common financial, economic, and political solution. But unlike, for example, the Euro crisis, now every country is affected and the stakes are simply much higher. Now to the current issues. Of course, I see there are two major current issues. The first is the immediate one, how to best treat and contain coronavirus victims, but at the same time, like I said, keep the supply lines open. These are supply lines that are related to the Schengen, the openness border agreement. So for example, the European Union very early stood up and said, like, you guys, yes, you can have border controls for emergency measures, but you need to keep you need to let the trucks that carry goods, that carry food, you need to keep that lines open to enable the supply of goods across the European Union, and that there are no shortages of any kinds. The other issue is, of course, how to best treat and contain. I know there are 27 countries, they're densely populated. They're also very different, right? The cities, I mean, northern Italy, which is very highly populated, of course, they had with a higher percentage of older people, more intense breakout. Madrid is still the epicenter within Spain, right? I'm also afraid personally of the refugee camps, because there are limited hygiene measures and also social distancing opportunities. So there's the immediate questions are like how to contain the virus, how, of course, to treat people. We know that just like in New York, hospital beds in Italy and Spain, they're overstretched, there are not enough ventilators, respirators, and all of these things. So that's where the European Union also is now trying to get the member states to actually bring borders from one country, doctors across borders from one country into Spain, Italy, where they are needed, to make sure there are enough ventilators, respirators being sent across borders if they're not needed in other countries. Now that's the first part, how to treat, contain, and how to keep sort of the supply open. And then the second one is, of course, the larger economic fallout. What economic stabilization measures should occur from the side of the European Union as well as the governments? Well, the governments in Europe, luckily, unlike in the US here, they have fairly good flexicurity, we call them flexicurity measures in place, whereby the governments, they pay short-time work subsidies. to companies if the companies, because of lack of work or lack of revenue, cannot pay the workers. So that enables companies still to pay the workers without them being unemployed and then having to become a burden on the states, which are already now burdened with the virus. From the side of the European Union, I can cite at least 3 measures, and there's actually a 4th one that's right now being hotly debated. There's a European Union Solidarity Fund that has 800 millions that was basically mobilized within 2 weeks or so, 800 millions to help crisis-plagued countries in the European Union. Next to the Solidarity Fund, there is the European Central Bank Pandemic Purchasing Program. That is also a couple hundred billions to buy government bonds from heavily indebted European member states such as Italy and Spain to basically give up their capitalization and their banking situation more generally. And the 3rd program that the EU already has decided to help with is the EU Unemployment Sure program that supplies 100 billion to governments so that the governments then pay it to companies so that the companies can pay their workers. So that's another 100 billion. Now, the big 4th opportunity that's still being debated. In fact, the Eurogroup's finance minister had yesterday a 16-hour inconclusive meeting, is sort of what kind of big bazooka aid can the Europeans pay? And so they already committed. So the European finance ministers, they already committed to provide either, and this is now the either or question, the financial loans to heavily affected countries such as Italy and Spain from the European Stability Mechanism, ESM, European Stability Mechanism. That would hand out, it has 500 billion in the fund. That would help. Spain would receive 30 billion, Italy would receive 40 billion initially, and there's much more possible with 500 billion. That's the first thing, that they can get this. The only question is, with the stability mechanism, are there any conditions? The other Europeans want to have certain conditions attached, such as, for example, that money needs to be spent on health policy or on market restructuring, but it cannot be used for anything else. And Italy and Spain in particular do not want to have conditions attached. The other question would be to have the so-called Corona bonds, and many people may have read about this. Corona bonds would be a form of debt mutualization, where all the European countries similar pay into a common fund, and then they take the responsibility for all the debt across Europe. However, there's much more resistance from particularly the richer, northern, more fiscally austere European member states, such as the Scandinavians, Netherlands, and Germany. But this is very much heavily favored from the southern Mediterranean countries, particularly Italy and Spain, which are heavily affected. We can talk about the pros and cons maybe in the discussion, but just to finish up. So the question for me that are sort of then open for the future are, well, if EU health policy is not yet Europeanized, maybe it should become a legal competence of the European Union to act. Maybe COVID has shown that the European Union because it is a transnational problem, need to be able to tackle health policy as such. Another one is how to deal in the medium long-term run with the economic impact. There will be a major recession occurring in the second half of the year. And how much money can the Europeans, shell out? Because every aid that comes from the European Union has to be paid in by European Union member states. And that eventually creates political internal tension. A third problem is privacy and democracy. As we have seen, Hungary, Orban's government in Hungary has used already the crisis to have an emergency decree without an end date. And he's already changing, basically, make constitutional changes without democratic control. Privacy, the issue of tracking people to make sure with cell phone tracking or other tracking measures, that's very sensitive in Europe, which has a much higher legal and normative standards for data privacy. Plus, we have misinformation campaigns by Russia and China. And lastly, of course, now the economic impact and the health impact of the corona will be with us at least 2 to 3 years. In that time, there will be no more money for climate change mitigation. So for example, have we already seen that the originally planned airline emissions tax for airlines coming into the European market, that has already died because of COVID. So there are a couple of open questions, but I'm sure we can talk about this later.
Marcus, thanks very much for those comments. Rebecca, let me turn to you to talk about a country outside the European Union, but obviously with a big impact and with a situation on its own, and that is, of course, Russia.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for inviting me to participate in this. One thing I want to just say and start with is the fact that while all this has been going on, I've been doing the page proofs for my book, which is on time and home in Russia and the Soviet Union. And it's just striking to me as I was reading for this moment and this event to think about the ways in which the past itself continues to weigh on the present and no doubt will inflect in the future, which is essentially what my book is about. So having said that, let me just talk for a few minutes about what is going on in Putin's Russia today. What about Russia, which of course continues to be one of the most authoritarian, politically speaking, regimes in Europe? Has Putin used the powers that he has and the powers that people have come to expect him to have to tighten and control this virus? Has he used his powers to make sure that all of his citizens are off the street in a very quick and swift way? What about the society that for so many kind of centuries, from one perspective, has been known to kind of follow the rules on the one hand, right? And it's used to the kind of strong hand of a government, while all kinds of things go on behind the scenes. One thing that's kind of obvious, I think, is that this moment presents a tremendous challenge to Putin, who himself imagines himself and markets, if you will, himself as Russia's hero, right? As the man, the only man who can restore Russia to the former Soviet Union's greatness and to bring stability to this country that seems so much instability. And anything really that messes with that image and crushes the myth of Putin as the savior and the hero could essentially be a devastating blow to Putin, politically speaking, right? And he's very concerned about that, regardless of the numbers of deaths. And of course, there's been a significant COVID-19 outbreak in Russia, and particularly, of course, in Moscow, and that this is, in fact, already devastating to Putin and his image, as tens of thousands will likely and are already beginning to be hospitalized and die. That ultimately punches a hole in Putin's image of himself and this narrative that he's been cultivating for so terribly long. Okay, so what in fact was the immediate response? So on January the 30th, the government of Russia closed its borders with China and suspended electronic visas to the Chinese people. And days later, Russia evacuated Russians in China on military planes, of course, the area of the largest outbreak at the time. And that very same month, passengers flying into Moscow from China, Iran, South Korea, again, the coronavirus epicenters at the time, had to undergo tests once they stepped off the plane and onto Russian soil. Meanwhile, citizens returning from Europe would have their temperatures taken, checked, and be quarantined for up to 14 days. So stuff happened. The government did kind of exert itself in those early days. And although these measures in some ways were early and swift, they ultimately did not prevent what is now a larger outbreak. And on their own, they were not tough enough. So what went wrong? First of all, one of the first things that happened is the testing itself in the Russian instance was conducted with locally made devices, as I understand it, which themselves were faulty, which is very familiar in the Soviet context, by the way, right? And all completed tests were sent to a single lab initially in Siberia, which itself had a kind of massive backlog. And this allowed Russians essentially to continue living their normal lives as these tests were going through the pipeline and so forth. It didn't really allow tracking in the early days, essentially. An epidemiologist at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, one of the most prestigious institutions, said, quote, "It's not that Russia responded slowly, it's that the response from the beginning was simply inadequate," right? Now, it hasn't gotten much better since those early days. A couple of weeks ago, now rather famously, if anybody follows social media, Putin announced weeks ago, Putin announced a week-long holiday. I'm sure you all read about this, right? A week-long vacation for the country, hoping somehow that people would stay inside. But of course, on the contrary, what did Muscovites do is they went out onto the streets and they started to kind of enjoy themselves in the nice spring weather for the so-called time off. So ultimately, that forced the Kremlin to come down hard and to mandate everybody stay inside rather than joyriding and partying on the streets. Because of the virus's now accelerating speed, the mayor of Moscow, for example, has decreed that all residents of the capital would be forbidden to leave their homes starting April the 1st and would need special passes to move about the city. So by late that day on the 1st, at least 14 Russian regions and all around the country's second biggest city, including Petersburg, had announced too that they were ordering a kind of stay-at-home initiative. So for weeks, the Kremlin and the state news media insisted that, unlike Italy, Spain, and more recently the US, Russia was tackling the virus without any major disruption. But it turned out ultimately not to be true, right? Meanwhile, I have to mention, while all of this is going on, and in fact, even in the early days, there's lots of creativity everywhere. There was from the very beginning, even as Putin was claiming this is not a problem and not acting very swiftly, there was community mobilization going on, especially in Moscow and in Petersburg. There was one group that have kind of young creative artists, also extremely kind of familiar to me as a scholar of Russian history, who in Petersburg, they dubbed themselves, and I can't say it because it's impolite, but I'll say it this way, the Stay the F Home movement, okay? They basically created this movement in St. Petersburg, and it was the creation of part of it was a virtual bar in Petersburg, where the rooms of the bar essentially exactly echo the bar itself, the actual bar that exists in Petersburg. And the whole point of it, and if you go onto the site, there are, you know, all kinds of creative songs and this and that, and it's also a place for people to meet and to kind of continue socializing, but also telling their audience to stay the F home. And that happened earlier than the government itself was issuing these orders. So, all right, something else I want to mention has to do with healthcare in the Russian context, and then I will wrap up. Since Russia is really headed now for a US-sized crisis, what of the Russian healthcare system? And here, as each of you you have said, the issue of information and misinformation, of course, is paramount, right? Russia's healthcare system is fairly well prepared, but of course, the virus will ultimately overwhelm it. The current healthcare system itself is built in the Soviet era, with its focus primarily on preventing actually large-scale disasters. In 1919, for example, Lenin himself issued a nationwide decree that everyone should get a smallpox vaccine, and those who didn't were ordered at best jailed at best and killed in other instances. Now it's not 1919 and Putin is not Lenin, but nonetheless, the point is there's an infrastructure in place. And to this day, a focus on preventing public health crises remains. An official has is known to say, the system is highly sensitive to any diseases which might be a threat to public health. So there is a kind of value within the Russian system to prevent kind of large-scale public health outbreaks. Okay. But there is a lot of doubt about the fact that even if the healthcare system, on the one hand, could handle and is equipped kind of historically to handle a large-scale public health crisis, in fact, there's all kinds of infrastructure problems that will ultimately prevent that and is preventing that from happening. For example, the issue of equipment, which of course is also very familiar from the Soviet moment. A lot of the equipment that Russian hospitals have, including ventilators, break down with alarming frequency. Russia is having to produce more, but it's unclear if they'll be able to do that in time, especially as also very familiar, if you follow Russian politics, the rich are hoarding them like nothing else. So when they are made, they're essentially hoarded by those with the cash and the connections. It's also not clear if there are enough intensive care nurses and so forth. And beyond that, the system may be failing its citizens in a larger sense, one that both David and Marcus have alluded to, which is that it's not really good at relaying truthful information to its citizenry. And this is a moment where governments need to, as we know well from the US case, need to be telling their citizens the truth. According to Russia's own statistics, Moscow saw a huge rise, for example, and this again is familiar to any of you following this, in pneumonia cases, right? There was a big kind of news story about all the pneumonia cases going up in January compared to the number of the year before. So the government was calling it pneumonia, but it looks like it could well have been, we don't know, it could have been the beginning of or already impacts from the coronavirus. Some have alleged, in fact, that while the whole world was facing an outbreak of this new coronavirus, Russia is facing an outbreak of a community-acquired pneumonia. Could it be that the lie perpetrated by the authorities? Asks Anastasia Vasilyevna, who's the president of the Doctors Alliance trade union and a top Putin critic, right? So she has a YouTube video where she makes this accusation. So it might sound in a way like a conspiracy theory, but there's precedent. In 2015, Putin began a big campaign to lower the death rate caused by cardiovascular disease. And almost immediately, hospitals began to report that fewer people were dying from heart conditions. What made that more suspicious is that there was a rise about the same time of deaths from other causes. So again, there's a clear suspicion at the very least that there's all kinds of misinformation flying around. So what about now? Other than doctoring the statistics or lying about cases, which ultimately will not be a winning strategy for Putin, right? I mean, we're figuring this out, then others are too. It's unclear what Putin plans to do next, or if his newfound kind of vigor in dealing with this health crisis will keep Russia from ruin. Most agree, though, that Putin will take whatever steps he must to ensure the crisis doesn't bring his country to a breaking point, and certainly doesn't bring himself as a leader to his end. So ultimately, we will see if the Kremlin will ramp up its efforts in the old Soviet style. So those are my thoughts and those are my comments. Thank you so much.
Rebecca, thanks very much for those insights. Martin, let's turn to you. You are a former Czech diplomat and now at FIU. Give us your perspective.
First of all, certainly I would join all others just to think first about those who got the direct hit, having been affected in their immediate environment. That's very clear. What I would say is that certainly we all are now finding ourselves in a crossroads. So I would be at least recognizing that everybody who is dealing with this issue, you can start on the level of local communities, states, institutions like European Union, or we can compare that with the conversation now being led between governors of states and the federal government, that everybody is trying to do something, and everybody is tested day after day with the situation. So obviously one thing is emergency, what can be done in hospitals here and there, what can be done to support those who are on the front line. But then obviously the second thing is ongoing process of reflection that is to help us not only to make right decisions in next days, weeks, months, and going up to what is now being referred to as a Marshall Plan for the future. Because it seems to me that the world is not going to be the same as it used to be before. Certain level of localization should go against globalization, if you want to use these simplified terms. But at the same time, it's very clear that some sort of localization first approach would not be the right thing, that we need to have a broader perspective. This is a global pandemic. All states, whole mankind is affected by that. So from my Czech perspective, obviously the question is how we can use our previous experience of the past in the current situation. On the one hand, certainly European Union organs, as all others, can take some criticism. They have not been prepared well. Member states now are trying to coordinate themselves, but each state has its own responsibilities towards its own population, and I can go on and on. What I would like to hope and pray is that this experience can certainly be using the fact that we are democracies, that there is a public debate here, that there is a certain level of rationality. Then certainly if we speak about pandemics, then doctors or those who are experts in these matters should have the first something to say. But at the same time, it's in the end of the day, a political problem will have to be dealt with by communities, by open communities in one way, and maybe by those who are run by totalitarian governments, or those leaders who have at least some temptations to use the current. All of them must be send clear signals. We are all in this. It's all our stake. Health is at stake. The most vulnerable people need to be protected, but at the same time, it's our freedom that is also being tested here, and that it is type of challenges or diseases.
Martin, thanks very much. Let me just follow up with each of you with a question. Marcus, if I can start with you. This crisis has exacerbated what was already a tense U.S.-EU relationship. President Trump didn't consult or warn the European leaders he was going to cut flights for non-Americans coming from Europe to the United States. There were these reports about efforts to work exclusively with a German company on a vaccine. Could you maybe talk about the impact this crisis has had on the U.S.-EU relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a second. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, if it wasn't already pretty obvious, you can hear me, right? Yeah. If it wasn't pretty obvious already that the Trump administration wasn't sort of the best case scenario for transatlantic relations, then to say it diplomatically, then this has just basically made the transatlantic rift even wider. The Europeans were really caught, they're really caught by surprise that the Trump administration, when was it? In mid-March, overnight pretty much imposed that travel ban for all Europeans. Because, you know, amongst European states, if it's kind of usually there's some kind of multilateralism, and you talk to other governments before you take any major actions. And this was very quickly, very unilaterally done. And so the Europeans really had that led to a waste of energy and time for the Europeans dealing with that issue in mid-March, which they could have put already into, you know, looking at the domestic containment of the crisis. So in that way, it's not only really deteriorated the transatlantic relations, but also cost the Europeans valuable time that they could have spent in containing the virus. And not just more recently, also you heard maybe that the Trump administration is aggressively sourcing masks and ventilators everywhere, and so Germany and Canada together have spoken out about this and have basically said you guys are trying to take away potentially available medical equipment from us. So the Europeans certainly were already not very keen under the previous action of the Trump administration, but the latest measures just have echoed the past and have led to a further acknowledgement of the Europeans that they can in the future, at least under the Trump administration. And that, of course, plays out on the backdrop of the elections this year, that the Europeans cannot count on the Trump administration, but in general also that they just see the United States generally, no matter which administration, as a less reliable partner than in the past.
Great, thanks, Marcus. Rebecca, if I can come to you, in addition to a problem that Putin faces at home with this crisis, he's also trying to exploit it by sending assistance to Italy in a big show, sending planes and forces that have raised questions about what Mr. Putin is really up to. We've also seen a disinformation effort coming out of Russia, trying to blame the United States for this. Can you maybe describe what Mr. Putin might be up to when it comes to activities beyond Russia with this crisis?
I mean, the only thing I would suggest there is that it's all part of the same show, which is to say, as you just yourself said, the kind of showing of might and resources and ability to help the kind of so-called weaker European states, from his perspective, only serves to kind of boost his own sense of heroism at home.
There have also been these stories of this Russian plane coming with assistance to the United States, questions about who paid for it and who provided it. But could providing assistance to other countries when Russia itself may be in need of these masks and ventilators and other things, could that come back to bite Putin?
I mean, it certainly should, David, but whether or not in fact it will is a question that is a very old one, because somehow often these kind of gestures of power ultimately do not weigh on popularity at home, or we don't know because we're not even sure what that means. How does one measure popularity at home in the Russian context these days? I mean, I think many of my own personal friends would say he's incredibly unpopular in this very moment and has been now for years, and yet there he is, stands still there. So it's hard to say. It's really my answer to that.
Martin, let me ask you, you touched on this, but we have seen, particularly say in the case of Hungary, some leaders exploit this crisis to really consolidate their power, act through emergency decree, and try to crack down on any, as they would describe it, fake news, but it may also extend to any criticism of government actions. Can you maybe talk about what we're seeing in terms of some disturbing semi-authoritarian trends?
So first, let me to answer or react to what Marcus said. I think now certainly we need to make a clear distinction between what is being referred to as a data. Maybe the statistical data doctors have, and it's hardly to put them into very different political contexts. And then you have facts, or this fake news, or all these things that can be turned into a political matter. I certainly understand that now the time of relationship between the United States and the European Union or European countries is challenging, because for obvious reasons, but it can be formulated other way around. It is maybe bigger needs and more urgency to have a communication and cooperation based on data, based on a European concept of rationality, a European concept of science, and certain traditions that are now being challenged in current historical crossroads. So I would certainly hope that this deeper layer of our relationship will come to the surface, no matter who is running the show here or there, that we have this opportunity and responsibility. And now let me to answer this question concerning, let's say, semi-authoritarian tendencies that are maybe being discussed more in the relationship to Hungary than any other state of our part of the, let's say, Visegrad group. I would say that in this moment, in the state of emergency, this is a temptation of all leaders who run executive, who are in charge, who are burdened with executive responsibility. That's very true, and I think that the weird thing is that to have this power for unlimited period of time. It's true that the decision has been made by the parliament that was elected democratically. So I hope that the externalities of this decision, maybe the fact that Hungary is a member state of the European Union, and that some signals are coming from not only from Brussels, but from member states and from his own political faction in the European Union, that he should consider that he should take the voices of democracy into position. And there are still people, they can speak up in Hungary, and certainly we should speak up for them. So I would not like to be a prophet of doom, trying to come up with some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that this is already on the way from democracy to some sort of autocracy. I still am a strong believer in power of democracy, And I'm a strong believer that post-totalitarian experience of Central Europeans really can make a difference. I'm not going to defend Hungarian governments on grounds that are not something that I would be supporting. But at the same time, I would certainly try to open the opportunities of communication based on rationality. I think that now European civilization is now challenged in its basics. And we need to find a way how to communicate, let's say, with other our partners in the world, in this post-European world. Certainly Chinese civilization is respectful and to be respected, but at the same time, these totalitarian tendencies and new imperialism of China is something that is really a big challenge, and I think that it needs certain clear response. Just react to what Rebecca said. Obviously, Russian position is not only influenced by the personal characters of Mr. Putin, but there are certain Russian traditions coming up to the surface here. And obviously, we know the Russian history, 20th century and before, very complicated thing. So I think that we are all coming to ourselves. We are all having a chance now to find where we are and what we can do to protect freedom. If I'm here a director of Václav Havel, a program for human rights and diplomacy, there is a certain legacy here. Legacy of individual responsibility, legacy of certain courage to stand clear in a certain situation. And maybe this now is a situation in which every one of us needs to make his mind, her mind, and do the right thing. Who is now in charge of making decisions on behalf of governments? So certainly they are in a slightly different position, but I think that freedom of expression, the capability to have a rational discussion on these matters, because we have a different time frames. We have a time frame of day after day when we see these numbers and rules or regulations and orders given by local and national authorities or federal authorities in the state case of United States. Everybody knows that this must be only a temporary solution, because obviously in certain moments the whole society will be under certain bigger and bigger stress. So we need to do it together. I think that even to be a little optimistic here when I'm observing situation from my local perspective, that even these discussions we are now fed day after day, President Trump's daily briefings demonstrate some signs that it's not just America first thing, that it is a global matter.
Okay, Martin, thanks very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Marcus Thiel, Rebecca Friedman, Martin Paulusz, my thanks to all three of you for joining us today for this discussion on pandemic in Europe. Thanks very much for joining us for this session today, this Dorothea Green lecture series. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them to sipa@fiu.edu. That's sipa@fiu.edu. I'm David Kramer. Thanks very much for joining us.